Check. Hello to everyone. Hello to everyone. Is it better? Okay. I'm really glad that you're here. Oh,
Me too.
Of our second lecture. It's a bit cold. So
Yeah, I agree.
today is with us Jamie. He's from England, and he's a member of the socialist resistance, which is part of the Fourth International.
The British section.
Yeah. And he's involved in campaign against climate change. As you can see, maybe it's, he have a reactionary badge, like love. What is that? I mean, that's it. He will speak about Ekosocializam. So
Yes.
Let's start.
Okay, great. Can I?
And for the last time, speak slow.
Okay. I have a tendency to speak quickly, a bit like Parisians in France. So if I speak too quickly, then just like wave at me or something. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to be speaking on Ekosocialism today. I've had quite an interesting discussion just before this, actually, with Igor. And I got a good kind of vibe of how there seems to be like a principle of how ecology is recognized as an issue in the country, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But there's no kind of political movement towards realizing any sort of objectives, no strategy, not even a Green Party, which is surprising for me. But it's something, I think we have a starting point at least, you know. Igor's going to ask me some questions on how to build how to go about building a movement, which I'll be answering after I've gone through this kind of 40-minute lecture. So yeah, I mean, I want to get people warmed up. I mean, I think we were a bit slow in the last session. I hope you've all had your coffee, and now you've got caffeine kind of thriving in your bloodstream. And I'm going to start with an exercise, actually. This is a bit unorthodox, but I'd like people to stick their hands up if they think that climate change is happening. Please, all of you, if you think that it is, do you think that climate change is happening? Luca? Yeah? Okay, and keep your hands up if you think that it's anthropogenic, i.e. caused by humans. Anthropogenic, as in caused by humans. Just please, sorry, join in. And yes, keep your hands up if you think that it's also caused by the capitalist economy. That's what I like. You feel the love in the room. No, I think we're vibing. So, I mean, my aim today is basically to go through, I'm going to revisit traditional texts of Marxism. So I'm going to be looking at volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Capital, as well as the Grundrisse, as well as looking at contemporary commentators on the ecological question and how Marxism can be used as a tool in our analysis of the ecological problem. So I hope you've all got your Marxist hats on, because this can be quite hardcore at times. So I'm going to be talking about basically Marx's conception of value, as well as historical materialism and how ecology can be built into the historical materialist concept, as well as productivism, consumerism, the short-termist kind of logic of the capitalist economy as well, and all of how this is in contradiction to the biosphere, i.e. nature. So bear with me, it's a lot of information. I will be reading off a sheet, but hey, that's life, isn't it? So according to the 2007 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, quite a famous report, warming of the climate system is unequivocal. That means it's unquestionable. What is more, most of the increasing global average temperature since the mid-20th century is very likely down to human causes. Okay? Obviously due to GHG emissions, so greenhouse gas emissions. This is carbon dioxide, nitrous oxides, and methane. Carbon dioxide is one of the one of the major ones, obviously. Methane is one of the most harming. And so is nitrous oxide. So with a significant majority of these observed increases taking place since the beginning of mass industrialization. So in Britain since the late 18th century, in other parts of the world a bit later, 19th, 20th century. So witness rising sea levels, increased instances of extreme weather, the melting of ice sheets, ocean acidification, increased rates of species extinction, the progressive undermining of biodiversity, coral bleaching, deforestation, increased levels of air and water pollution, diminishing crop yields, i.e. diminishing, like weakening, like amounts of crop, you know, indigenous communities under attack. Need I go on? I mean, it's quite clear that anthropogenic activity, i.e. human activity, is causing the warming of the globe. And what's more, we are heading towards an alarming rate, the 2 degrees centigrade tipping point, which means we can get runaway climate change after that. And the IPCC report actually says we should start moving forward by 2015 and reducing our emissions. But I mean, if you look at Copenhagen and those that kind of those state-centered kind of negotiations, they're not going anywhere. They've kind of decided that by 2020 we might do something. You know, we need to act, basically. So Marx once said that labour is the father of value and the earth is its mother. What did he mean by this? We have come to believe that the central tenet of Marxism is that labour is the source of all value. This is correct, yet incomplete. So, as we know, the labour theory of value places labour right at the centre of value production. The capitalist enters the market with his money, purchases labour power, puts this to work with means of production for a certain period of time, and then kindly relieves the worker of the value that he's created. So Marx also argues that without the material substratum, so the material element from nature that goes into the production process, you wouldn't actually have value in the first place. In other words, the product is created as part of the production process must embody a useful quality. So this is use value, what he constitutes, what he defines as use value. So to have use value, you must have a material element within the commodity. And also you need somebody to consume the product. For it to have a use value, it has to be seen as useful to somebody. They want to consume it. It's quite simple. So this useful quality, according to Marx, comes about during the active dialectical process whereby society meets nature through labour, that is during the production process. This is what Marx refers to as the social metabolic relation to nature. A relationship which stretches the history of anthropological existence. So as he himself states in Capital, labour as the creator of use values as useful labour is a condition of human existence which is independent of all forms of human society. It is an external natural necessity which mediates the metabolism between man and nature, and therefore human life itself. So the concept of metabolism is itself has been applied in the natural sciences since around the 1840s in order to explain the dynamic relationship of organic life with the surrounding environment. As John Bellamy Foster, a well-known Marxist ecologist who we'll come to in a bit more detail later, he explains that it refers to a complex process of metabolic exchange between society and nature, whereby an organism or a given cell draws upon materials and energy from its environment and converts these by way of various metabolic reactions into the building blocks of proteins and other compounds necessary for growth. It is thus important that we think of this social metabolic relation to nature as a complex of dialectical and organic exchanges of matter and energy, much like we see in the concept of the biosphere as popularized by a guy called Vernadsky in the 1920s. In other words, according to Marx, labour has acted as the great mediator between human beings and nature throughout the evolution, as part of an organic metabolic interrelationship whereby we reproduce and maintain our species life, or to use the more Feuerbachian, i.e. Feuerbach, who Marx criticised, Hegelian guy, he used species beings as the term. So what shape does this relationship take under capitalism? As is well known, Marx believed that our historical socio-economic epochs were defined not just by our relationship to nature, but how we relate to it through our labour, i.e. through what methods. So, as he states in Capital, Volume 1, it is not what is made, but how, and by what instruments of labour that distinguishes different economic epochs. All one has to think about is how we've come to characterise past socio-economic epochs, so the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, you know, the Industrial Age. So, in fact, it's actually been argued by a number of theorists, particularly James O'Connor and John Bellamy Foster, that a Marxian conception of historical materialism is actually incomplete without a larger emphasis upon the active role of nature. So Marxist Polanyists, so Karl Polanyi, a famous Marxist from the 20th century, so O'Connor is a Marxist Polanyiist. He's famously argued that the latest of our socio-economic epochs, capitalism, has not just one fundamental contradiction, i.e. that that between the forces of production and relations, i.e. between capital and labour. But that there is also a systematic tension between capital and nature, between capital and what he refers to as the conditions of production. This is labour, nature and infrastructure. He's got this conditions by building upon the concept of fictitious commodities by Karl Polanyi. And one which can drive the social and technical organisation of society into a new socialist era. So, you know, like the traditional kind of conception of historical materialism. And this is in fact a second contradiction, that with nature. So O'Connor makes the argument that Marx emphasised the active and not passive role of nature, and that this traditional conception of historical materialism, which expresses the tension between technical and social relations, makes too little room for nature's economy and too much for human economy. Indeed, we have overlooked the fact that Marx believed that our social metabolic relations to nature not only alters the objects of nature, but it also reconstitutes the subjects, i.e. us. So it's a dialectical process between us and nature, a reconstitution process. Okay, so we thus need to take into consideration the role of natural history in the constitution of society and how it relates to both the productive forces and the social relations of production. Accordingly, if we can envisage a delicate balance in our metabolic exchange with nature, we can also envisage a disequilibrium. You know, you can understand that nature kind of exists in an equilibrium in terms of its natural cycles, while we can also kind of imagine that there's a disequilibrium, an imbalance, caused by us, of course. In particular, a capitalist-induced moment of scarcity, according to, this is a concept, scarcity, a Marxian concept which O'Connor applies. He cites, for example, Marx's view on how bad harvests may induce a rate of profit crisis, as explained in his theories of surplus value, sometimes seen as Volume 4 of Capital. Furthermore, O'Connor ties this logic in with the traditional conception of historical materialism, but at the same time argues for a greater emphasis on the conditions of production, as I said, labour, nature and infrastructure. Maintaining the view that crisis moments are accompanied by movements of greater centralisation and socialisation in order to restore the rate of profit, themselves leading to more social forms of productive forces and thus moving us closer to the realisation of socialism. This is a bit abstract, but bear with me. This leads O'Connor to the conclusion that there's two contradictions, as I've said. Not just one between capital and labour, but there's two between capital and nature. Okay, so we come on to John Bellamy Foster. He's another Marxist ecologist. He's probably the most well-known, actually, and he's done a very good job, in my view, of kind of... I'm not trying to be anachronistic, so I'm not trying to read nature back into Marx. My argument is that nature is there already. It's just that you've got to kind of reread it, you know, look at it again. John Bellamy Foster, actually, he basically says I'm kind of assuming that people are aware of the materialist kind of conception of Marxism, so the materialist kind of centrality in Marxism. Well, this comes from Epicurus. I mean, Marx's dissertation was on Epicurus. I mean, I'm sure he was also very hungover, like we all are when we're writing our dissertations. I mean, Epicurus he focused his analyses on materialism, and he basically kind of came up with the idea of atoms. I mean, atoms and like a molecule and stuff. 2,000 years before it was actually proven by science. And Marx reads into Epicurus in his dissertation. He reads Epicurus into his ideas. And so Foster, what he does is go back to Marx's ideas of Epicurus and materialism, and kind of analyzes it, and so to kind of emphasize the fact that the materiality of his analysis is based upon nature. So I mean, nature is the materiality. I'm kind of drifting. I kind of want to. I was going to talk about how Immanuel Kant and Hegel and stuff like that, but basically what I wanted to say is that Marx used both Hegelian concepts of dialectics in a materialist sense. So he used both Hegelianism and Epicureanism. So he used dialectics and materialism in order to kind of get his methodology, his fundamental kind of logic in his analysis. So what he does, he basically gives nature an active or practical kind of. He gives it a role. He doesn't see it as passive. I mean, a lot of Marxian analysis sees nature as passive. It doesn't recognise it. It needs to be seen as an active kind of thing. As I said earlier, a reconstitution of the subject as well as the object. So, by way of this method, Foster and others argue that it's possible to interpret the social world as existing in an essential unity with the natural world. So it's in a dialectical kind of organic process. However much these realms may differ, and that this unity is played out in our productive existence. That is, through our social metabolic relation to nature, through the labour process. Indeed, Foster has argued that there is, in fact, a co-evolution between the social and the natural, a concept that has gained quite a lot of weight in the academic community, and was actually the central concept in a book I recently reviewed on the subject. So significantly, Foster also argues that, recognises that our metabolic relation to nature is enacted via our social and technical relations. That is, through the labour process and the technology that we apply during that process. Which is obviously very insignificant in terms of our analysis of the ecology, because it's the technology which we use when we're producing commodities, which can have quite detrimental effects on the environment. So as a result, we're provided with a conception of technology which not only recognises the class-based logic of technology, i.e. the contradiction between productivism and labour, and how efficiency drives kind of chuck labour out, which is the value producing. Anyway, but one which also allows us to analyse the technology applied during the production process. As Foster notes, Marx in Volume 3 of Capital explicitly argued in his critique of capitalist agriculture that while capitalism served to promote the technical development in agriculture, it also brought into being social relations that were incompatible with a sustainable agriculture. Following this logic then, Foster argues that the production process perpetuates both class-based power relations and the degradation of the environment. So as Marx himself argues again in Volume 1 of Capital, capitalist production only develops the techniques and the degree of combination of the social process of production, i.e. it only enters as part of the production process. Capitalism both, what he says, it simultaneously undermines the original sources of wealth, as I was saying earlier. The original sources of wealth, that's labour and nature. So it undermines both the soil and the worker, in his words. Marx bases his logic here on the growth of urbanisation. So if anybody's read Capital, you realise that you remember that you've got a separation of the worker from the means of production. So with urbanisation, you have a growth of populations within the economic centres, the cities, etc., and a movement away from the countryside, away from agricultural production. According to Marx, what happens as part of this process, there's a rift in terms of the nutrients which don't go back into the soil. So we move to the cities, we produce, we kind of defecate, so the nutrients that we consume do not go back into the soil, they get just flushed flushed down the sewage system. So there's a rift between the nutrients that needed to go back into the soil and the ones that have just gone into the city sewage system, basically. He bases these analyses on the work of a guy called Justus von Liebig, who was a very famous agricultural chemist in the mid-19th century. And he basically argues that the separation of the labour from the countryside, which is part of the process of primitive accumulation, by the way, and the creation of the wage labour force, which that's a part of, prevents the return to the soil of its constituent elements consumed by man in the form of food and clothing. This is a quote, by the way. Hence it hinders the operation of the eternal natural condition for the lasting fertility of the soil. So, I mean, if anybody didn't think that nature was part of Marxian analysis, there's a very good quote there that says it is. So that is, there is a metabolic rift. So I talked about the social metabolic relation to nature. There's a rift in that relationship, that organic relationship between society and nature. What Marx calls an irreparable rift, in fact. So John Bellamy Foster emphasises and builds upon this notion of a metabolic rift in Marx's writings. And he's popularised this in academic circles even. And he does this in order to explain the incessant drive for profits in the capitalist system and how this inevitably leads to the destruction of both sources of wealth, labour and nature. So what is more, Foster also argues that we can understand this metabolic rift as part of a driving force of capitalism in its seeking out of new areas of exploitation. Thus, as is the case with economic imperialism, as perpetuated by war and neo-colonialism, etc., you also could get like an ecological imperialism. So the seeking out of more of lands for your agricultural production, such as the production of foodstuffs in Latin America, which is shipped over to America, or whatever example you want to use. I mean, this is. I mean, it's all quite abstract. I mean, I'm talking about I'm basically this is one attempt to read nature into Marxism in a very central way. So looking at how nature is actually right at the centre of his concept of historical materialism. This is very important in terms of the logic of Marxism. It's very much fundamental to his thinking. But there are, of course, other ways that we can use Marxism to analyse the question of ecology. So first and foremost, there's productivism and its counterparts, rampant consumerism. So, I mean, there's a fundamental contradiction which many Marxists have recognised, that so the coercive laws of competition drive the economy forward. People drive for productivity and efficiency, they expand, they produce more and more commodities, and there's a need for consumers to buy these commodities. I mean, for me, it's clear that Marx was no productivist. He denounced the tendency of the system towards production for the sake of production. And its endless drive for the accumulation of capital, commodities, and hence on. He did this vehemently. Although I would concede that Engels had a slight tendency towards productivism, to be honest. I can take a quote from Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. He argues for the constantly accelerated development of productive forces and therewith for a particularly unlimited increase of production itself. If that doesn't sound like productivism, I don't know what does. Anyway, so regardless of where you lie on this question, it's clear that Marx saw both the capacity for the immense growth of the capitalist economy and the damaging effects that this expansive logic would have on nature, with it transmuting not only the capital-labour relation to a global plane, but also the capital-nature one. So in the Grundrisse, Marx explains how there is an exploitation of nature in order to discover new useful quantities within things. The exploration of the earth in all its directions to discover things of use as well as qualities of the old, such as new qualities of them as raw materials, etc. The development of the natural sciences to the highest point, likewise the discovery, creation and satisfaction of new needs arising from society itself, the cultivation of all the qualities of the human being. So, I mean, if you want to just think of consumerism, it's like the cultivation of everything. So you want to keep warm, you buy a coat, to that basic level, working up to, oh, I need social status, so I must go and buy, I don't know, like Madonna's new album. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, anyway, in other words, the tendency to productivism within the system feeds into the need for an outlet for the commodities produced and hence an exponential growth in a consumer market, with these tendencies leading to increasing rates of exploitation of nature. Following this logic then, we might choose to analyse global agribusiness. So perhaps the discovery of new use values in the form of vegetable fats. So we can take palm oil. So palm oil is like one of the most explosive commodities on the international trade market in the past few years. It's used as part of like, in terms of food production, it's used in the vegetable fat of a lot of food production. Anyway, these things are quite important in terms of the capitalist economy. And so if you basically just look at palm oil production in Indonesia, which is basically destroying one of the biggest rainforests on the planet, and thus undermining one of the biggest carbon sinks, i.e. one of the areas which drags all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Or you could take the production of jatropha in the Philippines, which jatropha is used to go into biofuels. So science has been used to produce like this commodity biofuel, which has been replaced because we have peak oil, so we're moving to biofuels. And I mean, these both of these kind of examples undermine the health of the worker in terms of the vast tracts of land that it takes up. It's been in the news quite recently. So agricultural production is taking up vast tracts of land which would normally be used for food production, but instead they're being used for biofuel production. And yeah, I mean, it's actually been estimated that 30% of food price rises in 2008 were down to biofuel production, which is quite a scary figure. There's also the fact that the production of these commodities is in the case of the palm oil, destroying one of the largest rainforests, as we've said, and in the case of the Philippines, it's taking away valuable nutrients from the soil and then shipping them across the other side of the planet. Or we could use the example of the global trade in cotton goods. So with its ever increasing demand in the West for fashionable kind of cotton products at rock bottom prices, this not only extends what we said as the metabolic rift between the production process and the point of consumption, so from Latin America to America. But it also perpetuates the exploitation of labour in the South. So, I mean, which is quite well documented, but it's also concealed by what Marx called the fetishistic, so fetish, kind of the concealment of the trade links and the exploitation of labour which lie behind these trade links. I mean, if you think of the globe as a very complex kind of like situation where people are trading constantly all the time, if you can't really see where that product's coming from, you don't really know where it's come from. You don't know whether it's damaging the planet, whether there's exploitation of labour behind the product, etc., etc. And so not only that, if you want to talk about these processes in more environmental terms, so the actual production process of these products is also very industrially intensive. So it's very mechanized and it uses a lot of oil. As well as, for instance, fertilizers and pesticides themselves are oil-based. Sorry. And I mean, the fertilizers themselves emit a lot of N2O, nitrous oxides. Not to mention the excessive amount of GHG emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, that the general production and eventual transportation of these goods entail, or that they include. So it's been estimated, for example, that between 44 and 50% of global GHGs, greenhouse gas emissions, are attributable to the practice of agribusiness, which is a very scary figure. So approximately 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, which produce, like creating the warming of the planet, are created by global agribusiness. Anyway, so we can on that basis, we can accept that agribusiness is contributing to the further warming of the climate. But that's not all. I mean, it also perpetuates the global kind of balance of inequality. I mean, namely by northern capital over the south. So besides the fact already mentioned that the drive to seek out new agricultural lands and markets undermines food production in the developing world, it is also well documented that changes in the climate caused by GHG emissions impact upon the ability of the South to maintain subsistence levels. So it's been estimated, for example, that with every 1 degree centigrade rise in the global temperature, there's an approximate 10% drop in the productivity of crops. So corn, wheat, rice, the productivity of that crop drops by 10% as the climate rises by 1 degree. So, I mean, we can take, if you take Bangladesh, for example, and how the heating of the climate has caused much more extreme weather events over there, which is then leading to what's known as salination of the soil, so the excessive salting of the soil, which then leads to the crops being a lack of, like the crops fail, basically. So yes, we can see further examples in the increasing rate of land grabs. So we see capital penetrating the south and wrenching away the means of production from local kind of small farmers and peasant farmers and subsistence farming communities such as the indigenous. These are kinds of issues which are highlighted brilliantly by people like Via Campesina, as well as the World Social Forums. If you wanted to get more information, these are very good sources, particularly Via Campesina. I mean, we could also use the example of the United States. So it's been estimated that if the world started adopting the same consuming patterns that the US does, the known petroleum resources would run out in 19 days. Also, it goes for the same in terms of meat consumption. You know, I don't know if anybody knows, but like cattle kind of production produces a lot of methane, which is very damaging to the environment. So, I mean, basically, in order to maintain these kinds of these rates of consumption, there has to be a global kind of inequality. You know, they have to kind of repress the South in order to maintain the North's consumption rate, which is morally culpable, if you want to see it in those terms. But anyway, I mean, I want to emphasize also there's what's quite annoying and will just not go away is what's known as the Malthusian argument. So there's a guy called Malthus, who in the 19th century basically said that the more that the population grows on the planet, the less we're going to have, like, the less resources we'll have to look after these people. I mean, we've reached 7 billion now. And this is something which is accepted on the left as well sometimes. But it's also been estimated that, I mean, for me, it's just the organisation of production. It's been estimated that between 10 to 12 billion people can be fed upon the amount of produce which is produced. But it's just how the capitalist system works is they kind of collects it at the top end of the scale, leaving those at the bottom to go hungry. Thus creating a kind of a dichotomy between abundance and scarcity. Yeah, so it's therefore clear that the global trade system is dominated by the productivist and consumer logic of the developed countries of capitalism, and that these not only perpetuate global inequality but also undermine the natural environment. Which brings me to my next point. So there's also a logic within capitalism which is basically geared towards short-termism. So, as Marx himself recognized, temporality, i.e. time, is key. So, he basically argued that the coercive laws of competition drive capitalists towards greater productivity and expansion, thus necessitating increasing amounts of natural resources to be extracted from the planet in order to maintain rates of profit. In other words, capitalism follows a linear logic in the enrichment of its material base. That is one of resource production and consumption. Very linear, and they don't care where the product goes. All they care is that there's somebody buying it at the end, and then they consumed it. They don't care how it's consumed. They don't care where the rubbish goes from the wrappings or anything. It doesn't care about recycling. So, in terms of logic, this works against the natural cycles of the planet. So the cycle works, the planet works on, if you think of it as a biosphere, it has these natural cycles that are interacting in a very dynamic way. And if you kind of introduce a linear logic, it contradicts this massively because you're not taking into consideration, let's take for example, geological timescales. So for oil to like exist, it has to have had lots of, like thousands of years of pressure and geological time in order to kind of create itself. It's an organic mass, you know. So oil, coal, or gas it takes thousands of years, like in a cyclical process in order to exist, for want of a better word. Also GHGs, so greenhouse gases. So the ones that are like GHGs emitted during the production process, they also upset the cyclical nature of the biosphere, as they emit more carbon into the atmosphere than the natural cycles of the planet can absorb. This is one of the reasons we're seeing growing acidification of the sea, and hence bleaching of the coral. So the only possible solution to these problems, as Marx argued, is the rational organisation of production in line with the natural cycles of the biosphere. As Marx himself argued in Volume 3 of Capital, and I quote, "Freedom can consist only in this, that socialised man, the associated producers, govern the human metabolism with nature in a rational way and bring it under their collective control." That is, in order to end the excessive exploitation of both the worker and the environment by capital, we must be in a position to bring our economy under collective control and reorganise it along the logic of a use-value-based economy, rather than on the basis of profit, basically. In other words, we need an eco-socialist revolution. The question is, how do we get there? So, I mean, my presence here today isn't to tell you what to do, but I mean, I do have some ideas in terms of strategy, which you may or may not want to follow, but these are some ideas. So, in my view, the left needs to be more engaged with the Green Movement, both in terms of campaigning and political party building. So you could take the Red-Green Alliance in Denmark, for instance. The campaigns themselves, along with the usual focuses, should be aimed at the reconnection of the worker with the means of production. So there's what's known as food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is, I mean, you've got like the MST in Brazil, which is the Landless Workers Reform Movement, which basically say, let's locally produce our own food. Let's not let global agribusiness dictate to us how we acquire our food. And so you're basically regaining autonomy in your own food production. You're localizing it. This happens in the Philippines. The Fourth International Section in the Philippines also practices this. Cooperatives in general, as well as being against the privatization of land. I mean, this is part of the relations of dominance and the exploitation of nature. Our campaign should also be aimed at the abolition of both the fossil fuel, biofuel and nuclear industries, illuminating the climate denial propagated by big business. Also, as Hugo Blanco, I don't know if people know who Hugo Blanco was, he was a contemporary of Che Guevara, and he actually led a Peruvian revolution in 1961. He's very much involved in indigenous communities and is very active on the eco-socialist issues. I mean, he himself says that what we need to be doing is standing in solidarity with those at the vanguard. So indigenous communities who are battling against global agribusiness, protecting what they called Pachamama, i.e. Mother Earth. We also need to be emphasising the way in which climate change affects women in adverse ways. For instance, ecofeminism is a new doctrine which has recently emerged and as a way of emphasising the plight of women of the South in this context. Trade unions, also, they're typically in favour of growth and stability because they want to protect the employment of their members. But in my view, we need to be emphasising alternatives to this kind of tactic of the trade unions. We need to be emphasising the need for the creation of employment in green sectors of the economy, such as the development of renewable energy, so wind farms, solar energy, etc. Also public transport. I mean, cars are one of the most polluting consumer goods that we could ever have, you know. If we get people using public transport, particularly free public transport, this would be good. Also, home insulation, this is also a tactic. Back in Britain, we actually have what's known as the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign. And as we speak, this is going around the country on a caravan and basically just promoting the idea of green jobs. And it's based on, I don't know if you were aware of it, but there was something called the Caravan of Hope in South Africa, which went around promoting green employment, particularly during the Durban talks, as well as the South Asian Climate Change, Gender and Food Sovereignty Caravan in Bangladesh, which was also very successful. On the question of reform, not having any illusions on the ecologizing of capitalism does not mean that we cannot support progressive transitional policies. Free public transportation, for instance, or the creation of green employment. Also, once in a position to implement policies, there needs to be a de-development of production, particularly in agriculture, in order to both deindustrialize the process and create employment. Capitalist industry has too much dead labor, and i.e. like too much dead labor, constant capital, i.e. technology, and not enough employment in the production process. This of course needs to be complemented by programs of development in the South in terms of both creating infrastructure and employment in the South. There also needs to be a deconsumerization in the West. People stop buying useless goods, and in the return to a use-value-based economy. Marx himself believed that the basis of a socialist economy is the reduction of the working day. In fact, this is a fundamental prerequisite if workers are to have input into the decision-making processes of society. And lastly, I mean, ultimately, anything that addresses the alienation of the worker from their product, from each other, and from nature. In conclusion then, which I'm sure you're all thankful for, Marx once said, and I quote, "Even an entire society, a nation, or all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not the owners of the earth. They are simply its possessors, its beneficiaries, and have to bequeath it in an improved state to succeeding generations, as boni patris familias." And I agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. I think that you gave us a good presentation of what ecosocialism is, and also put concrete conclusions of like in our fight on your presentation.
I hope so.
And thank you for that. Is there any questions? I think we have less than 15 minutes for the questions.
Okay.
Then
should I emphasize that you have to come down to the front as well and use one of these mics?
Hi. Beside the facts you said about connection between Marx and ecosocialism, I mean between Marx and ecology, I don't know if you mentioned, I didn't hear, so can you interpret what you think about sentence, one Marx sentence, I don't know in which book, he said, we need to humanize the nature and like naturalize the human. What do you think about that, and can you interpret that? Thank you.
Sorry, I actually know the quote he's talking about, but I can't think where it's from. So basically, he's basically saying that nature is, I mean, Marx says that nature is inorganic, the inorganic part of the human, so it's not part of the human as such, but it is his nature. So basically he says that nature and the human are so interlinked that they are each other. I mean, to save one is to save the other. I mean, my argument is that the adopting an ecology critique in Marxism and in our politics is fundamental and in order to save humanity. I mean, the science is there, global warming exists, and Marxism gives us the key in order to analyse how it's happening, and what we can do about it. And it's a fundamentally humanist perspective, because nature and the human, we exist in harmony. We exist with nature. We can't exist without it. It's fundamental to our existence. I mean, not just in a romantic sense, you know. It goes into the production of our commodities. It goes into our everyday lives, the material that we see, the material that we wear. It's fundamental to how we exist. And personally, I also quite like it. I quite like walking in the fields and walking in parks. And, I think it's a beautiful thing that we have. But slowly and unfortunately, we're destroying it by way of the way that we organise our production of commodities and how we exist and how we subsist, you know. But I'm sorry I can't remember the exact quote, but I know what you're talking about. But it's basically saying that the humans and nature are one, and that's it. But yeah, that's what I think on the matter.
Anyone else? Please.
Well, as we talked earlier about this topic, I was interested the most in concrete, practical advices, how to start a movement, an eco-socialist movement, and maybe from your experiences, you probably, or I'm sure you met a lot of people around the world from different movements, and maybe you have some practical experiences to share with us. And the second question would be, is there a point, I would say a point of no return, how much that melodramatic sounds, but how close are we to a point that the saving the nature wouldn't be possible anymore?
Yeah, very good question. Okay, I'll take the second one first. Okay, so I think it's quite clear I'm not a natural scientist. I've done degrees, but they're in social science and not in natural science. All I can do is kind of tell you the science which has already been investigated and reported. So I mean, I use the IPCC report 2007, which is the most comprehensive report on the issue up to date, up to now. And they basically, as I mentioned, they basically say that a 2 degrees centigrade rise produces a tipping point. And then this can create runaway climate change, so it's much harder to counteract the tendency. But they say that nobody's really come out with like a full horseman of the apocalypse moment. But they say that like if you get in between 4 and 6 degrees centigrade rises, you're looking at very, very dangerous and very, very volatile situations which are not in line with the natural evolution of the planet and its cycles. And so this is why people talk of scenarios of like London being like flooded with water with how long have we got left? I mean, we have 8 minutes left, no? Okay, okay, I don't care. So yeah, basically, regardless of what could happen and when, the point is that we need to start acting now. The point is, I mean, the IPCC report basically says that if we don't, that we need to start acting by 2015, reducing our emissions massively, 80% approximately in the West, and not so much in the South, obviously, because they don't produce as many gases. Yes, okay. So that's my answer to the second question. The first question, so how to start a movement? I mean, the movement starts when the objective conditions are there. I mean, there's got to be concern about the environment. You've got to be able to tap into that notion, that idea. So, I mean, tactics can be also, as I was saying to you earlier, you can hold a meeting on a topical issue. So is climate change happening? Can Marx explain it? What's the link between capitalism and the environment? Any sort of kind of topic like this could be used as a workshop question. Personally, I work very closely with green activists, not just Marxist activists, not just left-wing activists, but green activists. And I mean, I'm on the national committee of the campaign against climate change, which has got both left-wing activists in it and centre, kind of liberal activists in it. And there has to be a reconnection. I mean, we can't cause a revolution by ourselves. It's impossible. You have to work with different groups. It has to be a pluralist approach. I mean, look at your stuff. I mean, you got your organisation in Bosnia. You have, what is it, approximately 7. You have like anti-fascists. You have Marxists. You have a number of different groupings. These are the kind of pluralist kind of techniques that you need, tactics that you need to apply. Basically, reconnecting with society in general. I mean, I attend protest marches a lot. I go on, not like trade union or working class protests. I also go on green protests to emphasise that kind of issue. I mean, for me, the ecological issue has it has a lot of potential. So it can, for me, I mean, we'll talk about it in very abstract historical materialist terms, but it has the potential to basically wake people up to the fact that capitalism is not only destroying people, but it's destroying the planet at the same time. And for me, that means that it could, not only, it can, I mean, we've got to win those kinds of arguments on the left, but also there's, the green question is seen as a bit more, I mean, as I was saying to you, I mean, people like middle-class people back in Britain, I mean, obviously in Marxist terms they're working-class people, but culturally they're middle-class. And it's kind of very, it's like we're all going to be doing our recycling this weekend, you know, we're all very good, we're all very moral. And it's a very much an accepted kind of norm, is that the green question is there and that climate change is happening. And if you can convince people that an anti-capitalist critique is needed in order to solve this ecological question, then you can broaden the movement beyond Marxism, beyond socialism. You can capture the imagination of other people. And that's that's why I think it has the potential to reinvigorate the Marxist movement as well. So, yeah. So,
okay, thank you. And I think I think the lunch is on the table. I think you'll be more than glad to answer on your question later. So that's it. Thank
sorry,
you.
we were meant to finish in 4 minutes, but
I mean the boss is on the.
I know the boss is there, but we were meant to finish in 4 minutes. But do you know, you kind of stifling debate just because of food. Do you know what I mean? Can we please take the last question, and then we'll go for food? Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. I was just wondering, all the things that you've said are mostly about, I don't know, the South and what it's like in the North. I don't know if you have any idea of how it is here, because we have had the whole socialist system, let's say, and then nowadays we are in a country in transition, so we are, the capitalist system is really forced here. And I don't know, like when I was young 20 years ago, we used to live like that. We used to produce our own goods, and we used to buy in bulk, things like packaging, you know, things like that, which you talked about. And nowadays we are really pushed into the consumer society. And so that's one comment about, I'm not sure how we are to counteract that as individuals. I mean, and another comment is, I'm not sure how the eco-socialism really is